The Harvest Was Good This Year. Written by Devil Juice. Being a farmer has never been easy. It's honest work, but it's as hard as can be. Frankly, it's only getting harder as the years go by. Used to be that all I had to worry about was a poor harvest. Nowadays, I've got to deal with tariffs and the economy draining away any trace of profits. I've got to deal with climate change, pesticide-resistant bugs, and repair locks on my farm equipment that I need to bypass with Ukrainian firmware. Life as a farmer is hardly as simple as it used to be. With all of this in mind, I should have been happy to wake up this morning to a field full of corn waving gently in the breeze. Ecstatic even. The problem was, though, I hadn't planted corn. I stepped out onto my porch, rubbing my eyes in disbelief. However, no amount of rubbing wiped away the sight of the great field of corn that stretched as far as the eye could see. It surrounded us on all sides, stopping only just a couple of yards shy of the house. It had even sprung up around the barn and across the only road leading off the property, places where nothing had been planted at all. My two boys woke up shortly after I did, joining me on the porch. Neither of them had any more explanation for what had happened than I did. Johnny, my oldest, ventured to guess that maybe our supplier had screwed up and sent us corn instead of soybean seeds. However, that didn't even explain how they managed to spring up so quickly when we had only finished planting them the day before, or why they were growing where we hadn't even planted them. Besides, after 40 years of planting, I'd be a complete failure if I couldn't tell the difference between corn and soybean seeds. And what we had planted the other day was most certainly not corn. Given the state of my fields, though, I was more or less certain that what I had planted was not soybeans either. My youngest boy, Stevie, didn't pay much mind to any of that. When he looked out at those fields, all he saw was one thing and one thing alone: profit. I couldn't blame him for that. Much like any other child born into a down-on-its-luck farming family, he had a hunger for something more than the poverty that was his birthright. For him, though, this hunger had grown into an obsession, a wild need that I could never manage to rein in on my own. Unnatural or not, what Stevie saw out in those fields was a gold mine. It wasn't simply the value of the harvest itself, though, that attracted him, but the unusual qualities of the corn as well. A crop that could spring up overnight was worth more than he could even imagine. It was even better than a gold mine, really. Stevie insisted that we get out there and start harvesting immediately before one of our neighbors noticed our good fortune. I tried to argue with him, to tell him that we should consult with an expert before we started messing with that unnatural corn. But he was in no mood to listen to me. The boy practically had dollar signs in his eyes as he rushed off through the corn towards the barn that housed our farming equipment. Johnny sighed, shaking his head ever so slightly. He said that, unnatural or not, we wouldn't be able to consult with anyone or do much of anything for that matter, unless we could get the road clear. He said this before he headed off after his brother. Somehow, even though he hadn't taken either of our sides, I could tell that he most certainly wasn't even close to being on mine. I sat down uselessly on the porch, fetching a half-crumpled cigarette out of my back pocket and lighting it with my old trusty rusty Zippo. It was times like this that I really missed my late wife Debbie the most. She had always had a way with those boys that I could never manage to replicate. They always listened to her, and she took it upon herself to keep us all in line. All of this was done with little more than a few stern words. I, on the other hand, couldn't even manage to keep them physically reined in anymore. It was a fact that was becoming even more apparent as the years went on and I grew even more weak and feeble. I didn't even bother to try to chase after them, in spite of my misgivings. Even if I could manage to catch up to them, which wasn't even all that likely to begin with, what could I even do to stop them? I would have tried anyway, though, if I had any idea what would end up happening. I heard the distant rumble of an old engine as the barn door swung open and out came Stevie, riding our half-broken-down combine harvester. Only half broken down was the best we could manage most years, as we could rarely afford to fix whatever was wrong with it most of the time. Following behind him was Johnny, lugging one of the scythes we used when the harvester decided it didn't want to cooperate. Stevie set about harvesting in earnest as Johnny headed in the direction of the dirt road, clearing a path for himself as he went. It hadn't been running for more than a minute or two before the harvester ground to a halt out in the middle of the cornfield. Not particularly surprised by the piece of junk failing yet again, I peered out over the fields from the porch, trying to see if I could guess what was wrong with it from a distance. What I saw, though, did in fact end up surprising me. From what I could tell, it seemed like the stalks of corn had somehow managed to get tangled up in the blades. This had caused the machinery to jam. This was odd, given the fact that keeping the blades sharp was one of the bits of maintenance that we could actually manage to do regularly, despite not being able to afford parts. Heck, I had even sharpened them the other day. I cursed aloud to myself, hoping that the jam hadn't caused any further damage that we would inevitably be unable to truly fix. I quickly forgot about that, though, after what happened next. I looked on in disbelief as the path the harvester had cut through the corn started filling in behind it as new stalks of corn sprung up and grew to maturity before my very eyes. My heart fell to my stomach as a premonition of sorts hit me. This was just the beginning. Something worse was coming. My voice was shrill as I screamed for Johnny to get his brother. Johnny, in the midst of the field himself and having noticed the corn that he had cut was regrowing as well, wasted no time rushing off in the direction of the harvester. Stevie had exited the harvester's cab, but that was just about all that he could do. The corn around him had grown once more to its full height. Yet, it hadn't stopped there. Like vines, the stalks twined themselves around the harvester, creeping further and further up the sides. Stevie fought a few of them off as they tried to catch hold of him as well, climbing up onto the roof of the cab in order to escape. I called out to Johnny once more, yet he didn't respond. I couldn't find him among the rows of corn, his form having long disappeared amongst the swaying stalks. It was quiet, deathly so, yet not for long. There was this great, deep rumbling as loose dirt around the harvester erupted upwards. I had never experienced an earthquake before, but I imagined the sensation was much the same. The force of the ground shaking knocked me off my feet and caused half of the porch around me to collapse in on itself. The harvester started to tilt slightly. Stevie clung tightly to the roof of the cab as the ground split open beneath it. I struggled to my feet, screaming my boys' names at the top of my lungs. I could see Stevie screaming too, but neither of us could hear the other one over the roar of the earth. The split ground widened even further. It did not reveal the earthy crevasse that I was expecting, but instead the opening of a large, fleshy tube. It steamed in the crisp morning air, like the great, hot breath of some sort of massive beast. Its moist, ridged sides were lined with countless red root-like tendrils. These tendrils lashed out all at once, one group of them wrapping themselves around Stevie and the harvester, and the other, smaller group reaching out into the field. These tendrils displayed remarkable strength and dexterity as they hoisted up the massive harvester and fished Johnny out from where he was hidden in the field simultaneously. They both tried to struggle, Johnny trying uselessly to cut through the tendrils with the blade of his scythe. But none of their efforts made any difference. The look of fear on my boys' faces as those horrid tendrils pulled them downwards, the earth settling back into place seamlessly beneath them, will forever be burned into my mind and my very soul. It's been a few days since then, I think. I haven't been paying all that much attention. I've been making my way through what was left of our food supplies and my own personal supply of scotch. Things all seem to have blended together. I've been thinking a lot about my family, particularly Stevie. This is his computer, actually. He spent a lot of time on here and on this site in particular, when I wasn't dragging him out into the fields to work anyways. I've looked a bit through his posts history, his comments, and the other communities that he frequented. You know, that sort of thing. Turns out that I think we had a lot more in common than either of us ever knew. He never planned on staying here and living out his days as a farmer, like his old man. He wanted to travel and see the world. He wanted to move to Seattle and work at a famous tech company. It wasn't just a dream either. He really could have done it. It's all right here on his computer, plain to see. It makes me wonder if things could have gone differently for us all. Maybe if I hadn't fallen into farming just like my old man wanted me to. If I had followed my own dreams and taken us all far away from here. Maybe then I could have built a different life for us. A better life even. It's not like any of that matters now though. There's not much time left for me, I think. The corn, if you can even call it that, reaches all the way up to the house now. It's even managing to grow on the wood of the porch somehow. Strange, though I can't truly say that I care anymore. I really don't care about what happens to me or anything else for that matter. For a sad old man all on his own, this world is much too empty to be worth living in. Come on down to Albert's Corn Maze for a hauntingly good time. Written by Rotsoil. My name's Albert, and I tell ya, I'm a simple farmer, but I grow the best darn vegetables. People come from all over to buy my produce. It's much better than anything you can get in a store. And now that we're getting into the fall weather, I make this corn maze that everyone really loves. People get lost in there for hours. I like to give back to my community though. I hear they've been having some weird weather over in Mayersville. Nothing can get in or out lately, including fresh produce. So I loaded up my old truck to take some over. She's rusty and I've had her for forever, but she ain't never broke down on me yet. I call her Old Reliable. Driving through that town was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. Not a single person came up to my truck. They all just sat on their porches and watched me. It was real creepy. Every pair of eyes watched me as I drove through town. There were no kids playing outside, no one walking down the street or driving. The entire town just sat on their porches. And the creepiest part? They all looked melted too. Half of their faces were hanging off their skulls. They looked like some little kid had sculpted the whole town out of Play-Doh. It sent a shiver straight up my spine. I had thought about bringing my son Melvin with me, but this probably would have scared the pants right off him, if he wore pants. So I turned around and drove home. I didn't sell anything, but that's all right. I'm sure someone will buy them right up when I open the corn maze. It's almost done, and I'll tell ya, Melvin sure loves running around in that thing. Stays in there for hours, sometimes days. Don't worry about him though. He's a silly boy, but he's all right. I made him myself. I asked the missus for help, but she told me that it wasn't right. He probably would have turned out better if the missus had stuck around. But there was a small mishap. Anyways, he's a little twiggish. Mostly 'cause he's made of twigs and vines and stuff. Oh, and he's got this head like a Venus flytrap. See, this weird fella came rolling through and saw my farm and stopped and said hi. He said that I had some of the best produce that he'd ever seen, and then he said that he could sell me something to help them grow even better. I thought it sounded like a load of nonsense, but the missus said we should give him a chance. She was also so kind and generous. That's why I married her. I hope she passed all that on to Melvin in their short time together. Anyway, this weird little guy said that if we bought his fertilizer recipe, he'd throw in some rare seeds too. Said we'd have to fertilize it according to his recipe though, but that it was a guaranteed success. Mrs. was on board with it until she found out what goes into the fertilizer. As weird as that guy was, he was certainly onto something. He said that it would double, maybe even triple my profits. And by golly, he was right. He didn't leave any contact information, or I would have passed it on to some of the other local businesses here. So anyway, I planted those seeds and followed the instructions. All of the seeds died except one. I named him Melvin because it sounds like a smart name. The missus fainted when she met Melvin. I guess she was just so overcome with happiness. I know that I was. And Melvin's real smart too. He still hasn't gotten the hang of talking. He mostly just squeaks and chirps, but I can usually understand him. I'm trying to get him to help me finish up the corn maze. He sure loves testing it out. It's almost done though. If I can push through the night, I can probably finish it by tomorrow morning and then open it up for business. I know that people sure do love that pumpkin spice stuff. Anyway, when the morning came, I set up some signs advertising produce and hot chocolate and the corn maze. Although I thought that it was still a little too warm for hot chocolate, but people still buy this stuff anyway. I asked Melvin for help cleaning up a bit, but he just did his weird little high-pitched giggle and ran off into the corn maze. Surprisingly, people started arriving during the afternoon. I think it was still too bright outside for people to do the corn maze, so most of them just bought produce. I sell a lot of corn and a lot of tomatoes. I probably would have sold some more pumpkins, but they're not quite ready yet. A few people asked what the trick was to getting such big vegetables packed with so much flavor, and I just tell them that it's a trade secret. When the night started to fall, the most obnoxious group of kids showed up. A bunch of, what do the kids call them? Meatheads, jocks. They had some really pretty girls with them though. One of them was dressed in real tiny shorts and she had the prettiest hair I've ever seen. The missus always yelled at me for staring at the younger women, but I couldn't help myself. I know they dress like that on purpose. Their meathead friends were busy fooling around and punching each other. I could smell the alcohol on them. I told her that she might get cold later dressed like that, but she just sneered at me. I know it's all an act though. Women dress all revealing like this on purpose, and then feign repulsion when a fella like me shows up with interest in them. Then they squeal about it to their friends, but secretly, they like the attention. But sure enough, when the sun sat down, the air started to cool, and she started complaining that it was cold and she wanted to go home. Her friends were still too busy fooling around though. They had another friend with them, but she wasn't nearly as pretty as this one. She was just all right to look at. She suggested that they get some hot chocolate. After I handed them the cups, I saw them walk a few steps away and add something else to the cocoa from a flask. I guess that worked, cause soon after that she stopped complaining and the two of them were dancing along to some music. The one girl danced like a spastic fish out of water, but the pretty one, she sure knew how to twist and move, and I got a real nice view of her. "Hey, y'all should try the corn maze," I called over to them. She just scoffed, but the meatheads got really into the idea. "Yeah, let's do it," They cheered, falling all over each other. "Is it even a good idea? I mean, this place is kind of a dump," she said. She was clearly trying to play the not interested game. The missus had tried that when I first tried taking her out, but you can see how that worked out for her. "Well, sure," I said as coolly as I could. "There's people still in there, and it's a lot warmer. The corn's a good insulator." I winked at her. They paid up and headed inside. It wasn't long before we started hearing shrieks and giggles from the maze. I switched to the radio to play some music from a Halloween disc that I had bought a few years ago. The sounds from the corn maze blended right in with the music. Then I started hearing Melvin's giggles, followed by some screaming. I frowned, 'cause Melvin wasn't supposed to be in the maze when there were customers, so I headed inside. The air was cool, as a crisp breeze whispered through the rows and rows of corn. The dirt ground crunched beneath my boots. All was eerily silent, except for the muffled music and the occasional rustle of the corn. To the untrained person, the maze can be a real labyrinth. But since I'm the one who made it, I knew the thing like the back of my hand. I was surprised to see Melvin had done some decorating though. I turned left, right again, then left, until I came to an intersection where the path split in every direction. At one end, he had managed to move one of my scarecrows, and he had fit its head with an old rusty bear trap that I had lying around. At the other end was a string of little makeshift straw dolls. That boy is so creative. I'm so proud of him. I continued on. When the ground under my feet started squishing and squelching, I knew that something wasn't right. I followed the squishy path to a specifically long and winding dead end. At the end, Melvin had placed a couple of hay bales in case anyone needed to stop and take a rest. That boy is so darn considerate. And sure enough, one of the meatheads had stopped to take a load off. Except, in the dim light, I could see that he was slick with blood. His guts spilled out into his lap, and all his teeth had been pulled out and scattered around him. At the very least, he would make a convincing decoration for the time being. I headed deeper into the maze. Right, left, straight, and then left again. I had really outdone myself this year with the maze. There were plenty of dead turns for people to get stuck on. A few people had made it through and told me that it was one of the most difficult mazes they had ever been through. The next dead end I found ended abruptly. A deep trench had been dug, and several fence posts had been sharpened and stuck into the ground. The less pretty girl was impaled upon those posts, one sharp end poking right through her stomach. Her face was frozen in horror, and her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a scream, but blood just trickled out. "Melvin!" I called out. "Where are you, boy?" But he didn't answer. Instead, a sharp scream cut through the eerie night. I followed it until I found the pretty girl and the other meathead. Deep lacerations covered his body and blood pooled underneath him. The girl was on the ground next to him, breathing heavily. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Help me!" she screamed at me when she saw me. She sure was in pretty bad shape. One of her feet was cut almost clean off. Her long legs were stained with blood and bite marks. "Now, what's all this here?" I asked. "What kind of sick freak show are you putting on here?" she yelled at me. I didn't answer, but a rustling in the corn next to her caused her to gasp. She started to drag her body away from it, her foot dragging behind her, limp and useless. Melvin emerged from the corn, chittering and chirping like he always does. "Melvin, what have you gotten yourself into, boy?" I asked him. He just looked at me and cocked his head to the side. His mouth was open in a makeshift smile, revealing his sharp teeth. His mouth dripped blood and bits of flesh were stuck to his teeth. He squeaked and took another step towards the girl. The rest of his viney body was also stained with blood. "I bet you just wanted to help your old man, eh?" I said. The girl lay between us, looking back and forth, unsure of what to do. Melvin chirped again. I grinned at him. "All right now, let's get you out of here," I said to the girl as I picked her up and slung her over my shoulder. "Oh, thank you so much," she gushed. I guess this is what it took to get a pretty girl to be nice to you. "Wait, where are you going?" she said. I moved deeper into the corn maze and she started trying to hit and kick with her good foot. Nestled right at the edge of the cornfield was my old work shed. I kept a bunch of old rusty tools in there, some seeds and some other equipment. I pulled a key out of my pocket and I unlocked the door. Inside it was rank with unpleasant smells, but you got used to it after a while. Melvin trotted in behind me, eager to help. "Hey, what are you doing? Where are we going?" the girl shrieked, starting to hit me again. I flung her down on the work table, probably harder than I should have. She whimpered when she landed and then scrambled to get away from Melvin when he ran up to look at her. He snapped and growled. "What the hell is that?" she asked, pointing at something behind me. I turned around to see what she was pointing at. "Oh, that's the missus. She likes to watch me work." She was referencing the severely rotted, severed head that sat on top of a tool chest in the corner of the shed. I'll admit, it was pretty nasty, but I just couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. And I like looking at her every day. "Now, let's get to work," I said, pulling out a small hatchet. The bodies tonight would help fertilize my crops for months.